All right, so today is June 12th of 2021, and we had some pretty good price action to go over today. So we're going to break it down and talk about how it was traded. The context going into this is that we had a large sell-off, and following the large sell-off, we went into a multi-week range, and this is some of the price action that's taking place within the range. So we can see that we traded down towards the value area low after the open of the day and pretty much hugged that low for a while before we eventually broke down pretty harshly, and that's where the trap trader setup starts down at these lows here after breaking the range low. And following the trap trader setup, we had some good exhaustion plays and a couple of different types of setups that we can go over. So we're going to jump right into it on the print here. And this is that trap trader setup that we saw at the beginning. It's pretty discretionary how you decide to trade these. So I'm just going to talk about how I look at these things. Um, I don't, the preface that I should give before we talk about the actual setup, right, is I don't think that for most people this can be the standalone system. You're going to need other things, right? So how I do it is I have other things that tell me to take my lower time frame trades, and then once I get those signals, which are normally leading, I come here to get the real time development of it and decide to actually take the trade or not. So breaking the setup down, you have the harsh sell-off, and then you have the high volume node essentially of this 1 minute candle down here at the low. And basically, what you want to see for a trap trader setup is that you want to see a volume node develop at an extreme of a candle or an extreme of a little range that you're looking at, and then you want to see it trade through it and then trade back up above it. In this example, for it to be a sellers getting trapped, you would want to see you sell below the volume node and then trade back above it. And then, in this case, we even used it as support basically to then have our big move where the buyer stepped in. So, yeah, to break it down just to the granular detail, right, and explain it a little better, I guess, you identify the high volume node, which you need to have some sort of context, right? Ideally, this is happening, taking place into an area that makes sense to do business, right? You don't want to be looking at this and then just hopping in mid-range necessarily, unless you have a system that helps you do that. But anyways, so we have our low volume node, or a high volume node rather, that ideally is into a level, and then we see price trade below it, and the sellers stepped in really hard. And I mean, yeah, you have the 6 million and 9 million guys, and these people got crushed, right? Because we immediately traded back above it. And mind you, this is a 1 minute candle, so this is pretty quick. And yeah, you see the buyers attempted to step in following the high volume node, but they really weren't able to, mount the real assault just yet. This is generally how it goes, where they step in and then they don't, initially succeed. And then you have the follow through from sellers. They weren't able to actually sustain any momentum, right? They were just absorbed by the passive bid, and then the aggressive buyer stepped in and they hit it pretty hard. We used the node as support, and we marked up. And in this case, we actually marked up pretty strongly. We got complete void of a candle essentially, where we just teleported up pretty quickly, which leads us into our next setup type, which is really similar to that trap, although it's got slightly different. And we're in this instance using it to either flip short or just take profit on that long that we just took there, which it's basically the same exact type of thing where you have the violence into a level. um, you identify the node, you mark the node, you want to see us trade through the node and then trade back on its side. And this, the context of what we're seeing here that needs to be pointed out is that the buyer volume wasn't that high into this, but it's still is it a valid setup? But then notice the way that we saw the seller step in following it, and I think that that's what matters, because you had the aggressive sellers step in, and then you have a lot of longs taking profit throughout the rest of this. So this would be considered, in my opinion, an exhaustion setup. So this is something that I'm going to either, most likely be looking at just to be getting flat with, or I'm going to be taking a smaller um, directional trade back from once we came. But normally, yeah, I'm going to lean more into just using it to take profit. Um, so yeah, we have the low volume exhaustion setup where the sellers step in and the people that were longing, ideally down here should be, unwinding this. And basically, this unwind is going to lead to one more attempt, and we're going to see that where this is the continuation of the unwind, and then we have the buyer step in really harshly here, which is the sign that they're here to do something most likely after a move like this. So we trade back and we use the node that was created as support more or less, and we trade up pretty good. And now this is what I'm going to consider to be a true exhaustion setup and not like the original one, right? Because ultimately the original exhaustion setup that we looked at didn't really play out that well, right? It had like, 300 point um, reversal, but ideally you're looking for something a little more than that. So this is a much better example of an exhaustion setup where we have a lot more volume coming into that level, and you just basically throughout the next half an hour you see that the bulls will just weaken over and over again until the sellers eventually step in and unwind it on them, which mostly would probably be longs taking profit and a lot less actual active shorting, I think. um, which is pretty obvious right here, right? So you see the initial up thrust, right, where the majority of the volume comes in, the sellers initiate, the buyers attempt again, but it's just clearly a much weaker attempt, right? Because there's actually a pretty decent amount of volume that came in here, but they just weren't really able to even mark it up above this shelf, right? This would have been the level to get above for them. So then, basically we just fizzle, fizzle, fizzle. They have their last attempt, which is just absolutely pathetic, and then the sellers step in, which I'm pretty sure was just, yeah, longs unwinding, because they're, the longs, they see this and they can say, we're just gonna take what we already got on the day, right? So they're gonna unwind it, and that is a pretty good example right there of how some daily price action can go when you're in a range bound environment, right? Because ultimately all we did there was we deviated the range low and we got bought back up pretty quickly. We went and tested the opposite end of value basically, because it's I there's a bunch of different trading systems for it. I guess probably Dalton's is probably the most popular one for this concept, that when you deviate from the range or the value, whatever you want to identify it as, that it becomes an incredibly high probability that you're going to go test the opposite end. And the more violent, I don't think this is part of Dalton's or anything, but this is definitely something that I've experienced, that the more violent your test of one end is, that the more likely, to have violence on the opposite end are, right? So that's ultimately what we got. And then, so, to identify what we were actually looking at with the print, right? This is the original setup. This was the failed exhaustion. So you did get, an actionable trade, but it's just, it wasn't an ideal setup per my standards. So a less than ideal exhaustion followed by an actually legitimate exhaustion, which led to the fizzling. And yeah, I mean, seems pretty likely that we'll mark up from here, but that's kind of irrelevant. So yeah, we'll close it out there.